Okay, so here we are at day 2 of Herr, part 2 of this lecture, where I'm going to talk about levels of integration or degrees of integration. And if you're going to write a one-line description, I mean, this is the kind of thing which if you go and look up, say, military histories, or discussions of the military in Vietnam and so on, or if you look up an article in a military encyclopedia and you look up, say, African-American soldiers in Vietnam, something like that, you would get a line something like the following. I mean, I've sort of just, this is kind of just a loose paraphrase of sort of most of the things you're going to read it. And they'll say something like, so this would be a description of Black soldiers fighting in white armies in the United States in the 20th century. And they would say that although fully segregated between Black and white soldiers at the beginning of the century, that by the end of the century and the first Gulf War, 1991, the American forces were fully integrated. And that's true. But it like many truths, is absolutely partial, and well, that's in itself a contradiction. But it's enormous. It's very much a partial statement of the struggles that that African Americans suffered through during wartime, both civilians and both as civilians and as military. And so while Blacks weren't allowed to fight with whites in World War I, still they did fight in World War I, and they did go to France, and they were gassed in the trenches, and they were killed in the sort of usual terrible numbers in World War I. And this is something which Sergeant Major Huff talks about in his section in Bloods, Wallace Terry's Bloods. And it stands as an example in many ways of his generation of soldiers, that his father had gone and fought in World War I, and he fought and, expected himself to sign up. And, his father had been a model, basically, and he expected himself to do the same thing. So his generation of soldiers would follow that path. And this is on page 149 of Bloods, where he mentions his father. He also has the habit of joining the army as a way to declare pride and citizenship. This is the habit that Huff discusses, basically, that, why would an African American who is still suffering very much from the legacy of slavery, 19th century slavery, what would possess, you would think, an African American to join the white man's army, this man's army, as it's often referred to? And the answer are, as with most people who join the army, especially in the lead up to and then during World War II, because of patriotism and nationalism and pride and citizenship and all of the reasonable sort of things that people expect people to, why the deal, it basically is often offered, especially to young men, for why it's a good idea to go to war, which is in itself enormously problematic. But the deal was no different. Well, the offer was no different to Black soldiers. Like, fine, we'll take you, except that actually the offer was different, and it really wasn't. It didn't change effectively until Vietnam, which changed this. So Sergeant Major Huff tells this story. It tells the story of this as the Vietnam War is beginning to roll in the early 60s. And so remember that the story he tells is about 1963. And at this point, he doesn't say whether Kennedy, when in 63 it was. Remember that Kennedy was killed late in 63, right, in October. So 1963 is nearly over, and Johnson is about to take over and widen the war. Okay. But the African American population felt strengthened by the Kennedy election. They felt that Kennedy, although a lot of them weren't crazy about him, was in general the friend of the black man and woman. Was parenthetically, black women were included in the same way that when white men talked about white men, they meant and women included as second-class citizens, which meant that African American women were generally fourth-class citizens, right? Because it was white men, white women, black men, black women. And that's another, and thereby hangs another whole course. So Huff says, what you need to know about a sergeant major is that a sergeant major has fought in other wars, right? And so he's seen service, and when you have seen service, you'll remember, you've probably seen these generals who have a chest full of this block of multicolored ribbons that go across the chest. And they usually just on one side. It's usually on the, I'm just trying to think about this. It's usually on the right. Yeah, it's on the right side. And these are service ribbons, or some otherwise known as campaign ribbons. And they represent medals normally that would hang, but you can't put all the medals on because it would just be, you wouldn't be able to read the ribbons because they'd all hang over each other. So what they do is they just take as you enter a campaign, there's a color designated for the campaign. So let's say you fight at Anzio in Italy during World War II with a particular unit. There would be a service ribbon for that unit fighting in Italy during World War II. So you would have, say, the colors would be red, say red, white, red, something like that. So then that ribbon would show, there would be a bar with that. And then you'd have the next service ribbon and the next one. And that. So if you have a chest full of these service ribbons, and I'll put in a picture of this so you can see what I'm talking about. It indicates how long you've been serving, and it indicates where you've been. So some service ribbons are, more dramatic than others because people will say, "Oh, I recognize that ribbon. You were at, you were in Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was bombed." And it's like that kind of thing. It's pretty dramatic. Or you were at Bastogne, or you were, you were on the assault on you were in the assault on Berlin, or whatever. So he's got a chest full of these ribbons. In other words, he has fought in he has been in active duty for dozens of things of these service ribbons. And he has what he calls battle stars, which would be other medals that would have been pinned to the front of his uniform, and probably piping that he would be entitled to wear, because these are things you have to earn. You're not allowed to just go and buy them at the PX, at the post exchange. You have to earn them. You have to have the paper that says you have earned the right to wear blah 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 ribbon. And then the sergeant major is the top of the second to the top of the non-commissioned officers. So there are a little tiny bit of military history here, just military nomenclature, just so you know, like what the heck are people talking about. There are the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, sometimes called non-coms. And a non-commissioned officer is an officer who is usually, as they say, works for a living. That is, they're regular soldiers who have been promoted in the field, usually because of merit. So the sergeant would have 3 stripes, 3 chevrons in a row. And then the next level of sergeant would have 3 stripes and 1 rocker, as it's called. And the rocker is so there you have these 3 chevrons and then a rocker at the bottom. And then you go up to the next level of sergeant and you have 2 rockers. And so a sergeant major would have a full rocker, what's called a full rocker. So you have these 3 stripes and then a full rocker down below. So that it takes pretty much the whole top of the sleeve to, to show this patch, because it's just a lot of braid, or it's a lot of weaving. It's a lot of it's a lot of material. And it indicates that you are high up in the on-field command structure. Okay, so there are all these non-commissioned officers, and you can lose your job in the field. Like, you can be fired from being a sergeant, or you can be demoted. Anybody can be demoted, but you can be fired from being a sergeant, because, and they'll often say, you're fired, sergeant, you're fired. And it's like back to being a corporal, because you usually lose a rank when you're fired. So this is, and what's important about these non-commissioned officers is that they do the day-to-day work in the field of training men and women and how to run basically how to operate. And so they're, if you remember in Go Tell the Spartans, Oleanovsky is a sergeant, and Corsi is a corporal, I guess, Corporal Corsi, yeah. And then the commissioned officer is lieutenant. So Sergeant Major Huff is going to describe his uniform. When he describes his uniform, he's describing how much experience he has, and how that makes him, it puts him at the top of this hierarchy, which is going to be very important in the story. He says, but by me being a sergeant major, they had to watch their step with me. So in other words, if a white guy was going to come in to his camp and be racist, well, watch out, because the military is the military. And so here's the story. So this gunny sergeant was reporting in. So we have a not sergeant major, but a sergeant guns, usually called a gunnery sergeant. And gunnery sergeants are usually also very experienced, not as completely, they don't have the same authority as a sergeant major. But anyway, they can be very experienced, and they're usually in the field, and they as they will say, I work for a living. Don't sir me, I work for a living. You don't call a sergeant sir. You say sergeant. Yes, sergeant, because sergeant is the rank, and they're very proud of the fact that they're not commissioned officers. They're non-commissioned officers, which means they are still soldiers. They still work for a living, whereas a commissioned officer is supposed to be an officer and a gentleman, and there's all that stuff that goes along, the junk that goes along with it. Anyway, so this gunnery sergeant was reporting in, and he telephoned my quarters. This was 1963. Do you know what that damn chief clerk of yours done this evening? No, what did he do? He assigned me to stay in a room with a damn N-word. I says, is that right? He says, yes, sir, Sergeant Major, and I'd rather sleep on a parade ground under a flagpole than to sleep next to a goddamn black N-word. So I says, well, I can take care of you tonight. Tomorrow I'll assign you to your permanent quarters. I make it a practice to do everything I can, especially for my staff NCOs. So he's trying to take care of the non-commissioned officers, to look out for them. So I'm sitting there in my office with about 25 yards of campaign ribbons, a bucket of battle stars, and each one of my sleeves looks like a zebra. Okay, so he's got 25 yards of campaign ribbons, so his chest is completely covered with ribbons. A bucket of battle stars, there's battle stars all, wherever there isn't ribbon, there's battle stars. So other medals. And each one of my sleeves looks like a goddamn zebra. So this is because of these stripes, which are not only up because of the sergeant major. They run out of room on the top, and they have to put more chevrons down below, and then there's the piping around the cuffs, and so there's this massive amount. Just a sergeant major just looks like a walking sort of. They're so blindingly full of ribbons. You're like, oh my god, it's like military man. When the gunny walked in, he stopped and looked at me as though he saw a ghost, because he's African-American, right? He said, are you the sergeant major? Well, gunny, you are familiar with the rank structure, are you not? He said, you're not the one I talked to last night, are you? Why, sure I am. Sit down. And I made him drink some coffee, and the cup was rattling like a rattlesnake. So the guy got his cup of coffee. He's like, and he's so nervous. This cup is just rattling because he has been illegally racist to his superior. And his superior is a black man. And so in this very unusual situation in the early 1960s, and this is why I put this story in here, why I wanted you to pay attention to it, is that it's very how unusual it is to have a black man, this is really before the Vietnam War widens, be able to officially and legally tell off a white man for being racist. And in very few places, especially in the South, could a black man get away with treating a white man like the idiot he is in this particular case. And in this case, it's a remarkable story where Huff clearly has spent his life picking his battles, and he schools this gunnery sergeant in the most elegant, restrained sort of way. By the time America entered the Korean War, which is 1950 to 1954, the forces had moved closer to integration. But as you can see by Huff's story, the policy was that by 1963, it might be equality. The policy might be equality, but that didn't guarantee that you were actually going to have equality, which means that should the gunnery sergeant arrive and deal with a corporal who might be African-American, the gunnery sergeant could be just as racist as he wants to be to the corporal, not legally, but what's the corporal going to do? He's outranked.